It starts with misunderstanding, followed by fear, anger, hatred, followed by lying, stealing, and finally trying to murder you. War is when lines are drawn in the sand, and where those lines are, the space is invaded by someone, and blood is spilt. And it leads, and the consequence of war is that it leads to further violence for as long as it takes, for a very long time. And there's no real end to war, because if one side was to surrender or capitulate, what happens there is you're literally just kicking the same issue down the road for another time, because when you surrender, you become a prisoner to the other side's thoughts and beliefs. And for a long time, those thoughts and beliefs will lead to prejudice and racism and homophobic, or all those different issues. And then it just kicks off again 10, 15, 20 years down the line. What really brings a stop to war and that cycle of violence is hope. It's hope that when you start hoping to live a better life, and you start to accept that, yeah, things are not perfect, but we just have to live with each other until we can eventually resolve those issues. Um, it's through hope that eventually, that through many years of living in, perhaps if you're living under a tyrant or a king, if you're living under a dictatorship, if you're living under authoritarianism, eventually, after all the bullshit of looking at their excuses and saying whatever, uh, watching their propaganda all the time, you realize that you're not stupid. You're not a bullock in a field, okay? And eventually, those in power realize that it's time to allow people to start sharing their ideas and to express their feelings and their beliefs. Um, this happened way back. The first instance of this happened way back in Athens, where there was a tyrant. He ruled over Athens. Now Athens used to be constantly, it was a violent place. Nobody could get anything done, and they were under threat from the Persian Empire. So one day, this particular tyrant decided, you know what? Instead of me trying to come up with the rules, why don't we give the rest of them a chance? Okay, so what they did was they devised a voting system where the business people and the wise people in the town were given a vote, and basically they had to come together and form a committee and make a vote and decide how to go about things. And when that happened, things started to flourish. Business people started to see business opportunities. People were able to trade with the Greeks, and privately, individuals were starting to get rich, and from that, they were able to spread their affluence and their influence to other places. This was seen as a threat to the Persian Empire, so they used the Persian Empire liked to use the Spartans to attack Athens. And so one particular time, Athens was under threat of war. Only this time, the Athenians wanted to make it. They were motivated towards keeping their ideals and their beliefs, um, and they formed and they decided to defend their city or their state from the Spartans, and they were able to win. And as a consequence of that victory, many times over, the Persian Empire tried to eradicate them, and many times over, the Athenians were winning. And the one lesson that we learned from that was the fact that when you have something that you believe in, you fight for it. And the Athenians, they believed in democracy, and they were willing to fight and die for it. And whereas the warriors in the Persian Empire, they were essentially slaves. They had nothing to fight for, so they lost. and that was one of the main reasons why democracy spread in Mediterranean. It was taken up by the Romans later on. So we see many examples of democracy in around the world, all in different stages. The most Ireland has a fairly mature democracy where the last 60, 70 years, 100 years, we'll see. But the thing about democracy is if it is not being practiced, it tends to stagnate. And if it stagnates too much, people lose faith in it, and that allows authoritarianism to creep back in again. Another thing about democracy is where if you have two countries practicing democracy, for example, like in the United States and in Russia, for example, the Russians, in fairness to the Russians, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the democratic countries like America and Britain and Europe gave the Russians the time, the space, and the enterprise to actually develop their democracy. However, it looks pretty apparent that they couldn't. Well, the Russians, even if they did form a democracy at the time, it wasn't. They would have been looking at the models in Britain and America and in France that are many decades ahead of them. And of course, it's understandable that people would have been feeling very frustrated that democracy wasn't working in Russia. And so it gave into authoritarianism. And democracy is difficult. And we in the West probably don't realize that the instruments that we have, like insurance and private sector, public sector, capitalism, social responsibility, all those different principles, we learned these things ages ago, whereas the developing democracies, they're still lagging way behind, and they still don't see the values. They don't see those things, and so it really, in a way, it is our fault that we didn't promote democracy as well as we could have in the Commonwealth of Independent States. That being said, we're now going to see more of it. Again, democracy isn't the be-all and end-all. Okay, democracy is constantly changing all the time. Democracy gives space for more ideas, better ways of living, and newer ways of looking at things. An example of that would be the space program in America, where the Barack Obama administration allowed private sector to get involved with research and development in space. And as a consequence of it, companies like SpaceX were able to build up their experience towards flying into space and space operations. And in getting involved, for the private sector to get involved in space, that meant that instead of spending over $1 billion per astronaut going into space, the cost has gone down significantly. And furthermore, with research and development and innovation, we are now seeing reusable rockets, where instead of sending rockets up into space and then allowing them to drop into the Pacific Ocean, we now have machines that can fly up, do their thing, and fly back to their landing pads, and that has saved a serious amount of money. And because of those innovations and cost savings, it is now feasible for more commercial activities to be in space. Perhaps not going to Mars or colonizing the moon, but definitely in the lines of operating in orbit around the Earth in terms of research, development, and science. Um, there are plenty of more examples of where democracy promotes other ideas. For example, in medical, you have the cost of medicine, the cost of keeping ourselves healthy. We have the private sector and we have the public sector, and what we're finding is that with the private sector, it means it not everybody can get private health insurance, but at least if you have the option of getting better medical treatment, you're probably better off purchasing private medical health insurance to cover your costs. Um, so democracy is important. Democracy is the consequence of peace, and in order to have peace, we have to have no war. So that's all I have to say. Take care.